Good afternoon from Washington, D.C., and welcome to a timely discussion on seeking asylum from the local to the global. SIS Global to Local is an event series sponsored by American University School of International Service. Each event explores an important issue from the perspective of DC, US, and international organizations. Asylum is an extremely complex issue and involves the granting of legal protection to those who are unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or a political opinion. In the United States, asylum law dictates you must be physically present in the United States or be seeking entry into the US at a port of entry. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, as of mid-2020, there were 4.2 million asylum seekers in the world. While seeking asylum is a human right enshrined in international law and in the domestic law of many countries, it has become an increasingly political and politicized issue in the United States, in Europe, and in other contexts. Asylum is also tied to critical issues of immigration detention and deportation. Before I turn to our distinguished panelists today, who will speak to some of the dimensions of asylum in the DMV area in the United States and in several contexts in the international system, I want to be upfront about a few shortcomings of this event. First, asylum has a gender dimension, and while today we will be speaking extensively about the challenges facing women and girls, asylum seekers, women and girl asylum seekers in the US context, I do want to be mindful of the fact there are specific issues related to the LGBTQ plus community in terms of asylum in the United States and Europe and other places in the world. The second is that policy, practice, and research too often overlook the realities of refugees and asylum seekers with intellectual and/or physical disabilities. I've requested our panelists to highlight concerns surrounding marginalized communities whenever possible within the scope of their work in their respective discussions. The dynamics of a changing panel at a time when there is a lot of issues happening within the United States and abroad has also meant that one of our panelists bears the unequal burden of talking about asylum in the international context. Asylum processes, opportunities, and lack thereof vary significantly from one country to the next, and certainly between the regions of Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. I hope this is the beginning of a conversation and a learning opportunity for all those who are interested in asylum. And in terms of more ways to talk about asylum in a comparative context. Today's discussion will last for about 50 minutes, with 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Closed captioning is available to those who need it. Please click on the option at the bottom of your screens. We ask that no one record this session. We will be recording the webinar, and it will be available to you on the SIS YouTube channel. Without further ado, then, let me introduce you to our distinguished panelists. Mr. Eric Lopez, Senior Attorney with the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition, or CAIR. Ms. Irena Sullivan, Senior Immigration Policy Counsel with the Tahirih Justice Center. Ms. Lucero Ortiz, the Deputy Director of Mexico at Kids in Need of Defense. And Mr. Zaid Hydari, Executive Director of Refugee Solidarity Network. Let me begin today's panel with an opening question for every single one of these panelists. Given each of your areas of work, in what specific ways and why has asylum become such a political issue? So let me ask, starting from perhaps Ms. Sullivan, you would like to begin?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me today. And thanks to all the participants who've joined us. I think that the nuance and humanity within our entire immigration system has largely been lost over the past few years. And I think that the narrative around humanitarian protection in particular has become conflated with national security and immigration more broadly. And so if you are broadly anti-immigration, then this is sort of spilling over into the asylum context. And with regard to women and girls claims, which is my focus area, in the past, protections for refugees and asylum seekers and survivors of gender-based violence have enjoyed bipartisan support in general in legislation. For example, the Violence Against Women Act, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. These are all laws that have enjoyed this bipartisan support to differing degrees. And I think this has been significantly eroded at this point. And one example of a politically driven narrative around women immigrating is an exaggerated stereotype of women getting pregnant to give birth in the US. Another idea is that violence against women is so pervasive that women are successfully fleeing to the US in droves. And we know that this is not now and has never been true because as I'll discuss a little bit later, women are among the most vulnerable refugees, so it is exceedingly difficult for them to escape in the first place.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. I just wanted to also introduce to the audience Mr. Abdoulaziz Moussa Djibril, who joined us, who's an advocate for the CAIR Coalition. So I want to turn to Ms. Lucero to talk about the same question about the politicization of asylum, and then I'll move on to Mr. Djibril to continue this conversation.
Yes, thank you again for having me. I'm Lucero Ortiz. I'm the Deputy Director for KIND Mexico. KIND is Kids in Need of Defense. It's an organization that was started in 2008, really to respond to the TVPRA. So thank you, Irena, for talking to us a little bit about the laws and the regulations that are in place to protect asylum seekers. Particularly, we focus on unaccompanied children. That is individual children who are under the age of 18, who are presenting or are detected at a port of entry or between ports of entry, and who are traveling alone, meaning that they are not with a biological parent or a legal guardian. And at the time of detection, they don't have any kind of status in the United States. So unaccompanied children are particularly vulnerable, and really there are many protections under, again, the TVPRA and other regulations that allow them to seek asylum as well as other types of protections in the United States. And it's very important as we're looking to a new administration and as we're still in a pandemic that we highlight the importance and again, the vulnerability of this group, many of whom, in order to really understand what's happening with unaccompanied children, we really need to understand the history of immigration as a whole and the waves of immigration that have come before. And also the fact that when we talk about family separation, we really think about a lot of the events of 2018 when children were separated forcibly from their parents and their guardians by the former administration. But we really do need to think about family separation from a broader context, meaning that, again, the history of our enforcement going back to, really 1986, the last time when we had comprehensive immigration reform, looking at the Clinton administration in 1996 and how that impacted the waves of unaccompanied children that we see today. So it's very important to talk about what's happening today from a very historical perspective and to understand the importance of highlighting vulnerable groups and ensuring their protection in all of these different conversations. And then I'll leave you and I want to hear from other folks by really thinking again that migration, immigration, folks making sure that folks have access to asylum is also something that's very much tied to foreign relations and the push and pull factors, right? So what's happening in terms of the causes, the root causes in the countries of origin. We see the majority of children who are coming to the United States seeking protection, coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And so we really need to look at what's happening in those countries and how the US has historically had an impact in the destabilization of the governments and the economies, and what we have a role to really make sure that we address root causes as well as the protections in the United States.
Thank you, Ms. Ortiz. Mr. Djibril, just turning to the question of, the politicization of asylum, would you like to share a few words in terms of how you have seen this play out in the context of your work?
Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me on this discussion. So, as you say, my name is Abdoulaziz, and I am an immigrant, and I'm also a lawyer by training and a former judge in my country. So currently, I am an immigration advocate with CAIR, and I'm trying to, show and talks about what I have been through when I was on the process. So first of all, the migratory question is a phenomenon of a society. So like any other social phenomenon, it is invited into the political scene. So that's not only an issue in America, but that's an issue everywhere. So therefore, asylum has become a political issue. But the, the most important thing is that we should not forget that the immigrant is above all a human being who has fled a persecution. So we just have to keep that on our mind, that we have in front of us a human being who just fled a persecution. So that's what I wanna just add about what the other participants said already.
Thank you, Mr. Djibril. Mr. Lopez, turning to you, in terms of the politicization of asylum, just a few thoughts from your point of view in the line of work that you do with CAIR.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel discussion. And so the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition, we represent, in terms of my project, detained adults in deportation proceedings. And in terms of the politicization of asylum in our region here, within the lens of the work that we do at the CAIR Coalition, we primarily see this play out in terms of the former administration's policy changes. You know, as the executive branch has great scope and authority to change immigration policy. Of course, not immigration law, but actual policy setting, prioritization of who should be enforcement priorities for ICE, for example. So we've seen this play out in terms of a politicized attack on who is eligible for asylum in the United States, and that is the Department of Homeland Security's and Department of Justice rule setting and rulemaking over the last 4 years or so, in terms of limiting the scope of who is eligible, primarily who is ineligible at this point, you know, in terms of the focus of what the former administration's goals seem to be, is to limit the eligibility and increase the ineligibility of those who might be otherwise eligible and have a valid claim for asylum, to make it as difficult to access asylum as a form of relief. Now we see this play out in terms of the substantive law and procedural policies that apply to immigrants themselves and to asylum seekers themselves, but we also saw this play out in terms of structural institutional changes by the former administration in terms of the immigration courts, for example, imposing quotas of case resolutions on immigration judges, for example, the former Department of Justice secretaries self-certifying case law to themselves, Board of Immigration's appeals decisions. The consequence of this is they get to unilaterally rewrite the legal framework. And in the context of asylum, it's a politicized, it is a very politicized thing, because it's not by chance or by accident that over the last 4 years, the eligibility for asylum, the procedural kind of processes for asylum seekers to follow, the kind of tools at one's disposal to be able to secure and complete an asylum claim have been very much constrained and attacked. And that is a politicization that is going to have ramifications for quite some time in terms of correcting and of undoing a lot of the damage that has been done in terms of the asylum process and accessibility of it. In terms of the prioritization of enforcement, even asylum seekers who would otherwise not have been enforcement priorities under prior administrations became enforcement priorities in terms of ICE detention and deportation. That is how we've seen it play out at the CAIR Coalition in terms of detained adults and what we've encountered in terms of our local populations being jailed and deported and having to navigate the immigration court system.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. Turning to Mr. Hydari, in terms of the international arena and this discussion about the politicization of asylum, what are your reflections in terms of what you have observed with your work with RSN?
Yeah, I want to also thank you for inviting me and having me here on the panel today. What was mentioned by a couple of the other panelists, Ms. Ortiz, Mr. Djibril, I think I wanted to highlight the role that politicization has played in foreign relations. In many respects, the politics of asylum and refugee issues at the national level similarly get reflected at the international level. And I think that's in part both because many countries recognize that they can leverage asylum, refugee issues, and migration issues in the course of their foreign relations with other countries, and they can use it as bargaining with the international community to gain certain things. But also I want to highlight the fact that many host countries are feeling overwhelmed and are feeling like they are disproportionately shouldering the responsibility of the international community, and are in large part trying to secure as much assistance as possible in the face of years and years of like I said, shouldering responsibility. And that then gets played out when they feel like they are not being supported adequately by the international community and by other nations that may have the resources to support them. This then plays out and gets intermixed into political negotiations, and we're seeing that increasingly, and I'll talk about that. I'm happy to talk about that more as we continue.
Thank you, Mr. Hydari. To start from the very local, I wanted to start with Mr. Lopez in terms of giving our audience a basic sense of detention facilities in the DMV area. It may be news for a lot of people to sort of even engage with the fact that we have detention facilities. So just a sense of what kind of detention facilities are in the area around which American University exists. And also in terms of the threat of deportation that is being faced by immigrants in the general area. What is the current trend with regard to both deportation and detention of immigrants?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll give just an overview of the detention facilities in our region. And our organization provides services to all of the immigration detention centers in this region. In Maryland, we're talking about Worcester County Jail on the Eastern Shore. We're talking about Howard County Jail in Howard County, just outside of Baltimore. Previously, we were also servicing the Frederick County Jail in Maryland as well. They have since, during the pandemic, not been detaining immigrants at that jail. But there are two other local detention facilities in Virginia, at Caroline and at Farmville. And the populations detained there, when ICE apprehends and detains a local resident here in the region, they are likely sent to either a facility in Maryland or Virginia. But it's not limited to just residents of Maryland and Virginia. ICE transfers people across the country readily. We've seen people be apprehended up here where I am in Baltimore City, end up in Virginia, end up in Georgia, end up in Louisiana. There is a flow and a transfer of immigrants across the country by ICE, and that is just something that they do. That is a challenge with respect to accessing those immigrants that have been detained and providing them legal representation and giving them access to counsel is a challenge. Right? These facilities are remote, not by chance, right? They're difficult to access. They're far away from urban centers where there might be legal services, nonprofit providers, the private bar, for example, right? And it all kind of points towards inaccessibility of legal representation and also inaccessibility of contact with generally one's community and family and friends for support. In terms of trends, certainly during the last year, just the volume of ICE detention across the country has decreased from where it was previously. And that is true across the country, but it is also true here locally in the DMV region. That is to say that ICE detention isn't continuing. It's very much an ongoing practice for ICE to be detaining immigrants and forcing them to proceed with their immigration proceedings while detained. The other part of that is it's difficult to secure the release of detained immigrants. And it's unnecessarily difficult, especially during a pandemic. In terms of that, in the context of where we're at right now, I mean, you may have seen news articles out there about the outbreak of COVID in ICE facilities across the country. There was outbreak of COVID here reported in national news at the Farmville facility, for example. That is definitely adding a different kind of layer to ICE detention, a different kind of tone to ICE detention in the immigration system. But I think to not take up more space here on this topic, there are ICE facilities here. ICE is active, and I think it's also important to know that there are many community organizations and other institutions and providers trying to provide services to those who are detained. And so I'm not just painting a bleak picture of ICE detention in the region, even though that's something to be worried about as well. But there are many organizations actively trying to provide support for our local community members who are detained.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. Turning to you, Mr. Djibril, based on, what you've shared kindly with us, the fact that you've had your journey into the United States as an asylum seeker, and now based on your asylum work, what kind of patterns and in terms of challenges have you seen that asylum seekers in the DMV face when they try to navigate the US asylum system?
So as you already know, the issue of asylum is so vast. So I will limit myself to those who are detained, because I was detained, and that's all what I actually know, and that's what I am advocating now with CAIR. So first and the foremost, the important challenge that the asylum seeker, the detained asylum seeker are facing is the lack of information. So let me just stay down to earth. We haven't access to the basics information about our rights, and I remember one time I had one co-detained who was freaking out because the judge wasn't able to find an interpret in his language. So that was his right. He doesn't have to, to get scared about that, but he was so scared that he couldn't go in front of the judge. So we need some people who works inside the facility, and they are there only for give information to those people who are in detention, like doctors, people who we can be we can have some trust to them, and if we have some question, go see them and ask them. So that was the most important thing that we were I personally noticed the lake, but I mean, I was a lawyer, I knew my rights, but those people who were surrounding me, they were so stressed and freaking out. So the other thing is I had the chance that CAIR was able to give me a free representations lawyer for my cases, but everybody don't get those chances. So and they are not lawyers. They don't know nothing about judicial trial. So they were like, where should I go? What should I do next? What I have to do now? So in my opinion, I think that should be the first piece. If we could change something, that would be the first thing that I would change.
Thank you so much, Mr. Djibril. That was really powerful in terms of having a personal sort of insight into the structural challenges that asylum seekers face that a lot of people on the outside are not aware of. I want to turn to Ms. Ortiz right now in terms of the ongoing situation at the border where it's conveniently being framed again as a crisis, and it's becoming more and more of a political issue. And the focus is moving away from the emergency that the children, particularly the unaccompanied children, are facing. And I wanted to ask you a little more about the demographics. You mentioned already where most of the children are coming from. If you could just elaborate a little more on that and what it looks like in the border in terms of, you know, who are arriving, why is the current situation being again called a surge and a crisis? And then what are the challenges that child asylum seekers face that are different from adults?
Great. So one of the things I want to start with to answer this question is really thinking through and talking about the implementation of Title 42, which is a CDC order that was issued right around this time last year. And it was issued with the pretense of addressing the COVID pandemic and spread. But we have talked to many professionals who have said that there are measures that can be put into place at the border to ensure that people, including and particularly vulnerable communities like unaccompanied children, can present and still be given the protection that is outlined for them in US and international law, while also addressing the pandemic. Unfortunately, though, for most of 2020, we did see that the border was effectively closed for the vast majority of individuals seeking protection, including unaccompanied children. If we look at CBP statistics for fiscal year 2019, there were close to 70,000 unaccompanied children that were detected and were given the UAC or unaccompanied child status and the protection that comes along with it. But for fiscal year 2020, we saw less than half. So we saw 30,000 individuals that were able to, again, present themselves and seek the protection and the designation as an unaccompanied child. So we saw a lot of individuals, not only those in MPP, and MPP again is the migrant protection protocols that were put into place by the prior administration, where we had thousands of families, mostly women and children in Mexico waiting for their asylum interviews and their asylum court hearings. And we saw, again, many, many children, in that case, accompanied by their parents. And one of the unintended consequences of MPP was that we did see families make the very difficult decision to send their children ahead. And effectively really choosing to separate the family because they wanted the children to have that protection. We also saw children, unaccompanied children who were traveling by themselves, stay in Mexico, again, in very difficult conditions. We saw along the US-Mexico border an increase, and knowing that even prior to the implementation of Title 42 and MPP, that there were already dangerous conditions for migrants who were unfortunately targeted and exploited by criminal entities along the US-Mexico border and along the migration route. And so effectively closing the border really put them in a situation where they were really extremely vulnerable to that violence that was already taking place and already targeting them. So I won't go into the details of the recent reports of migrants being tortured and murdered along the migration route in Mexico, but that is definitely, again, an unintended consequence, or perhaps intended, right? If we really talk about the former administration and their strategies about really trying to make the situation as hard as possible so that folks chose not to migrate. But we know that, again, individuals are not migrating because the United States is the only country they want to live in. Most folks don't want to leave their countries, but they are forced to leave their countries, again, because of persecution. We've seen recently severe hurricanes, severe climate change, food instability and insecurity in home countries, gang violence, and other types of intrafamily violence that is really forcing particularly children to flee. So when children come to KIND and other organizations within our network, our client profile is the following. We see individuals usually around the age of 14 years of age when they are seeking protection. In terms of our client base, 61% of them are boys and 38% of them are girls. And about 1% is transgender or non-binary. Again, the countries of origin primarily are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And we've seen shifts. We saw for many years that El Salvador was the largest sending country. And most recently, we've started to see that Honduras is now a larger sending country. And again, thinking about some of those push factors or some of those factors that are driving folks out, we know that Honduras has one of the highest crime and murder rates in the world. And then also thinking about climate instability and famine and other types of food insecurity issues, which are very, very prominent and pronounced in Honduras at this time. We also represent unaccompanied children from Mexico, as well as 73 other countries. And the languages that they speak are primarily Spanish, but we do have an increasing number of individuals who speak indigenous languages, including Mayan languages. And our client base speaks over 88 other languages. So these are all challenges and opportunities for us to really make sure that they are getting high quality representation. In the United States, there is no constitutional or other law that allows or provides an unaccompanied child legal representation. And so we have represented children, even though the average age, as I mentioned to you, is 14 years of age, we have represented children who are less than a year, who are just a couple of months old, through children that are 17 and almost 18, the day before their 18th birthday. And so as you can imagine, children are really seeking stability and protection from this persecution that they're fleeing. Many times they are, and unfortunately we have seen that they have been victims of crime during their migration journey. We have seen the opportunity for them to reunify with family members. Many times their biological parents are the United States. And so they are seeking that reunification here in the United States. And we know that oftentimes the ability to reunify with those family members is very difficult now, again, given the challenges that we've discussed. Another thing that we see is, as I mentioned earlier, with Title 42 and the border closing, there has been a very difficult shifting of the border. So many countries, whether it be Mexico or Guatemala or some of the countries really along the way, have also started to implement very anti-immigrant policies that have made the journey even harder. So we see that children who are traveling by themselves often will travel with other groups of individuals from their country or from their city. And we've seen also large numbers of caravans, right? And we know that migrants feel more safe in caravans so that they will not be targeted by criminal entities along the way. And we've seen, unfortunately, that those caravans have been stopped along the way. And so the border closures, not only in the United States, but also along Mexico and Guatemala, in Honduras and El Salvador, we see that folks are having to take alternative routes, which are more dangerous, and again, make them more susceptible to criminal entities and exploitation. So those are just some of the reasons, again, that it is so important that as we're talking about different vulnerable populations, whether it be unaccompanied children or women and families, or the LGBT community, again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, in the next round. But we do see, again, many trans individuals and LGBTQI plus individuals who are trying to travel within groups or have support of community as they're seeking protection due to being targeted in their home countries for their gender identity, which is unfortunately something that they often face along the migration route as well.
Thank you so much for such a comprehensive discussion with regard to unaccompanied children and children who are trying to travel to the United States with their families to seek asylum. Ms. Sullivan, turning to you now, can you provide the audience with a sense of the different kinds of challenges that particularly impact women and girls in terms of seeking asylum and navigating the U.S. asylum system based on your work with the Tahirih Justice Center?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, it's very difficult for women and girls to flee in the first place from their country. The odds are really stacked against them. And oftentimes it's because they lack access to family resources or travel documents, or they must be accompanied by a male relative when traveling. So it's incredibly dangerous and risky for them to flee in the first place. And the types of abuses we see among our clients are what are called honor crimes, widow rituals, female genital mutilation and cutting, domestic violence. We see a lot of forced marriage cases, sexual assault, persecution of feminists, human trafficking, and persecution and severe discrimination against individuals because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. And some of the characteristics that gender-based violence generally shares, all forms of gender-based violence share typically are intense stigma, shame, blame and disbelief of survivors, ostracization from family and community, a lack of reporting as a result of all these issues. Women often fail to report the crimes against them, which is then held against them that they didn't report them. A lack of prosecution in a woman's home country of crimes, gender-based violence and related crimes, and a lack of laws protecting women from violence. And the other sort of category of characteristic that is common to many gender-based claims is that the persecution is inflicted by a non-state actor persecutor. So oftentimes it's a family member or community member, and that requires an additional evidentiary burden for a woman who must now prove that her government did not or was not capable of protecting her from these non-state actors. And for those arriving at the border, it's incredibly difficult. They have to first express the desire to apply for asylum and then undergo a preliminary screening by an asylum officer to even get their foot in the door. And under the former administration, Border Patrol officers were actually conducting these screenings. And so as you could possibly imagine, this was a very highly re-traumatizing process for survivors of gender-based violence and other trauma, especially if they had been abused by government officials. And they're now in front of this officer, oftentimes armed and in uniform, trying to disclose very intimate details of abuses. And there was not a whole lot of trauma-informed interviewing, that kind of thing. And so fortunately, this policy has now been revoked. And so asylum officers are now conducting those screenings. There's also extremely complex legal standards for gender-based persecution claims. And the former administration rolled back even those legal standards. And there were cases, as another panelist mentioned, that the Attorney General decided, and there was a regulation that was promulgated that very specifically sought to narrow protections for the types of abuses that I mentioned earlier, in particular domestic violence. And above all, in addition to these very specific measures that were targeted toward these claims, there was also sort of like a death by 1,000 cuts effect. And so there were quite a lot of, the former administration was very prolific as far as promulgating regulations that were aiming to really curtail people's rights in many contexts that ultimately produced a chilling effect for survivors, so that they no longer wanted to even come forward to apply for relief for fear that they would be deported before they even got a chance to apply. And this is exacerbated for gender-based violence who are experiencing domestic violence simultaneously in the US. A very specific example for as to how the administration tried to make survivors' claims even more difficult was the elimination in the State Department reports of the reporting on violence against women in a home country. So you can imagine a woman is trying to prove her case with these State Department reports that is like the baseline of evidence in asylum cases, and suddenly the piece on violence against women in the home country is missing, so she can't establish those facts. So another problem is that even where there are favorable laws that remain, decision makers over the past several years have been emboldened to deny cases when they disagree with those laws. So there's quite a fluctuation among adjudicators throughout the country as to which laws are being followed and which are not. And finally, as far as our work with survivors, we provide legal services and social services coordination. And sometimes, reproductive health issues will come up in this context. For example, clients who have survived rape and FGMC will require specialized medical treatment, particularly if they're pregnant and are giving birth. And the main context where we do see reproductive health issues arise is for asylees reporting unhealthy dynamics and relationships that prompt conversations with service providers about birth control and prenatal care. And they're also very concerned about supporting themselves and their children, particularly where there's also intimate partner violence going on at the same time. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sullivan, and thank you for breaking sort of apart the kind of logistical, legal, as well as, of course, intimate and personal dimensions of obstacles that exist for women and girls today in trying to seek asylum within the US system. Turning to the international arena, Mr. Hydari, you are presented with the enormous task of using comparative cases about the kinds of challenges asylum seekers face. And certainly, given the scope of your work, please use one or two examples to illustrate your points, and particularly in the context of a global anti-immigrant and xenophobic sort of environment that sort of has made asylum such a political issue. What have been your observations?
Thank you so much for recognizing that tall order. I can't begin to speak to the entire international arena, but certainly we'll try to paint a picture briefly from my organization's vantage point and use a couple of contexts that we work in. Let me say first that a major challenge that a lot of asylum seekers face in some parts of the world is a lack of a legal framework that recognizes refugees in the first place. So, here we are talking largely, about the US context. We have a Refugee Act that's been in place since 1980. I'm talking about certain contexts where there is no legal distinction and no legal recognition for refugees. And that obviously is a major impediment and major challenge to refugees arriving there. In other countries, in other major host countries in the world, you have frameworks, but they are either new or nascent. Again, in the United States, we've had a Refugee Act since 1980. In a country like, take for example, Turkey, that is hosting the world's largest population of asylum seekers and refugees in the world, has put in place a brand new legal framework as of 2014. And this is a complex legal framework that has only gone into effect 5-6 years ago at a time when the country is hosting historic numbers. So the work that my organization does, and in a country like Turkey where there's a new framework, you need a number of things in order to have a smooth asylum system. When I say smooth, I also mean fair asylum system for those who are going through it. And that involves at all levels of government, including government officials that are fully aware of both international and national standards, judicial officials that are aware of international and national standards, legal service providers, lawyers and practitioners, and all kinds of other NGO service providers. So there's a whole host of work that has to be done to build up a system that will provide a fair opportunity for people to go through that. And we're hearing about some of the challenges in the US that have developed, even though we have this system for many, many decades now. In many contexts, it's hard to even start to build that up from the ground up. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of investment. The work that my organization does is to support national partners in such countries and provide tailored assistance depending on what the needs are. So for example, in Bangladesh, which is hosting, over about 1 million Rohingya refugees right now, there is no legal framework that recognizes refugees at the national level. So the work my organization is doing with local partners is to try to outline what some protections may be available under the existing national law and how those can be applied, and to help promote the development of an asylum system. In a country like Turkey, we're supporting the delivery of legal assistance services through partners so that we can engage the nascent framework and try to make it work. And so I think, in many host countries, they're facing many of the same challenges that have been identified by our other speakers, but are even further behind in having the time to be able to work through those systems and develop them. And that's something that we've been paying a lot of attention to and invest a lot of time and energy into.
Thank you, Mr. Hydari. I think we might have time for a short second round, but I do request that the responses are kept a little short so that we have time for a Q&A session. In terms of the question then, turning to you, Mr. Lopez, just briefly, do you see any shifts, substantive shifts between the two administrations, the one that just left and the one that we currently have, in terms of deportation and detention rates? Because there is certainly a lot of uncertainty and a lot of criticism that's already in circulation about deportations that continue to be carried out, including, of course, asylum seekers who are, from Haiti, and so on and so forth. So please, could you illustrate a little more on that?
Sure, absolutely. In terms of and I will keep it brief. In terms of substantive changes with respect to detention and deportation, substantive changes are executive orders by the Biden administration, implementation guidance memo from DHS, explicitly overturning the 2017 detention priorities executive order under the former administration. So there's some substantive changes there. I think, under the former administration, essentially all immigrants, all people in the US without any lawful status became enforcement priorities. What we're seeing now is a return to a prioritization of those who are considered public, safety dangers, for example. There was a moratorium that was on deportations for 100 days. That was also a part of this change in policy under the Biden administration. A district court in Texas put a stop to that part of the new Biden administration executive orders policies. Now, in terms of what's the actual application of this, in terms of the current administration, there's definitely a lot that leaves to be desired in terms of the ongoing detention of immigrants, the ongoing deportations. You mentioned the deportation flights to Haiti. I mean, there were young children on those flights, and this is just a completely unnecessary thing that is happening, right? This does not need to perpetuate, but detention in the immigration context precedes the former administration. Under the current administration, there's no sign that that is going to change.
Mr. Djibril, in terms of any specific openings that you are observing with this current administration, in terms of some of the issues that you have raised, in terms of lack of services or structural support that asylum seekers within the detention receive, have you seen a different kind of energy or a different kind of conversation that has emerged recently?
Yeah, you can hear me now. So no, but the thing is, there is some word that marks me when Biden and Harris get elected. Biden says that it's time to heal America. So what I'm saying today is, don't forget immigrants too. It's time also to heal immigrants. So, and the main recommendation that I can make today is to seek what I call a new way of thinking. Immigrant is not an enemy. It's just a human being who are seeking protection and shelter. So the other thing that I am recommending today is that the detention should be an exception and not a right. So it should be an exception and should be contained on its primarily necessity. So the thing is, for example, as long as an immigration officers granted you what they call the gradable fear, there is no more necessity to keep you detained. So that's not logic. And then the third thing that I'm thinking is that how can you expect me to bring evidence of my persecution if you keep me in detention, if you keep me far of the internet? So I don't have access to the internet, I don't have access to my own luggage, and you still expecting me to prove the persecution that I have faced? I mean, that's not, I mean, there is no common sense on this politics. So all what I recommend today is what I, as I said before, what I call a new way of thinking. So we need to, bring all this down and then build another infrastructures. I mean, legal infrastructures.
Thank you, Mr. Djibril. On the note of immigration detention, and I know, Ms. Ortiz, you are going to have to leave very soon. So there has been a lot of conversation about Homestead in Miami-Dade County, which has been, I believe, the largest child migrant detention facility. But I believe that there's just been recent signaling that that is not going to reopen. So for those of people who don't know much about child immigration detention centers and have this question, well, what are we supposed to do with children, particularly unaccompanied children who are arriving at the borders? Where do we keep them then? What is CAIR's response, and what is the discussion that people should be happening about processing asylum seekers?
So it's important to, again, return to the law. So we do have laws and regulations that actually outline the processing of unaccompanied children. The TVPRA assigns divided responsibility between CBP and ORR, which is the Office of Refugee Resettlement that is housed within HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, as Irena and other folks discussed earlier, CBP officers are not the individuals that should be doing any kind of interviews or processing when it comes to actual protection. And so we know for children in the processing of children that they are best attended, and then their needs are best addressed under ORR. So within the TVPRA, the law outlines that children should be in CBP custody for no more than 72 hours and should be transferred then to an ORR shelter. We also have under Title 8 and the Flores Agreement, specific, those laws establish national politics around the detention, the treatment, as well as the release of unaccompanied children. And once, even before Title 42 and the current pandemic situation, we did see that there was an average of about 60 days in which children were in ORR shelters. During the time that they're in an ORR shelter, they are designated a social worker, and that social worker's job is to locate an individual, whether it be a family sponsor or a non-family sponsor, but somebody who is willing to house the child outside of a detention facility or an ORR shelter, while the child is going through their immigration proceeding and presenting their petition for protection. And so again, even before Title 42, even before the pandemic, there was an average of about 60 days in which the child was spending in ORR shelters. So now what we're seeing with Carrizo Springs and the discussion about opening other facilities is a couple of things. So we understand because of the pandemic and because of the need to have social distancing, and again, really making sure and holding CBP and ORR, holding them to their responsibilities under the law, it's important that children be transferred out of CBP custody as soon as possible and into ORR custody. And that ORR is working to locate a sponsor, in most cases a family member, for the child to be reunified within really more as quickly as possible. So we don't want the situation to go more than 60 days, right? Which was, again, the average prior to the pandemic. And so that's one of the things that we're seeing. And so we understand the need to have these facilities to make sure that social distancing and other pandemic protocols are put into place. But by the same token, it's very important that the processing is not get lost, and that ultimately the most important thing is that children are with their sponsors. And for those that are being reunified with family members, that reunification take place as soon as possible. And so there are many efforts to make sure that as soon as children are designated as unaccompanied children, that ORR is able to actually be in the CBP facilities as soon as possible and start that process with their social worker as soon as possible to make sure that they reach their sponsor's home much earlier than the 60-day average time period that we saw before the pandemic. So again, something that we were pushing for under the last administration was, again, to process these children and to put pandemic protocols in place. Now we're seeing that, but we're also seeing that there are lots of different factors that need to be taken into account to make sure that the processing is done according to the law, according to the Flores Agreement, and in the best interest of the children and the reunification with family members in the United States.
Thank you, Ms. Ortiz. Turning to Ms. Sullivan, what are some of the specific recommendations Tahirih would make with regard to women and girl asylum seekers in terms of the challenges that you have outlined?
Yeah, just really quick, I think a main piece of this is restoring and updating training modules on gender-based violence for adjudicators, particularly with regard to credibility assessments and how to weigh evidence appropriately given the challenges I mentioned and that my fellow panelists mentioned with regard to fleeing violence to begin with and then being detained, not having representation, and interviewing techniques that might be dehumanizing, even when interviewing someone who's a survivor of sexual assault, those types of concerns. Restoring stakeholder engagement. So what we've seen the last couple of years is virtually no communication between government and advocates. And that's a key piece of trying to improve the system, is restoring that communication among stakeholders. Also, as far as substantively, I think that making sure that the rule that I mentioned earlier that basically was aiming to gut asylum and specifically target gender asylum for removal and for eliminating the ability to apply for asylum based on gender. I think making sure that that rule remains enjoined permanently, and rescinding cases that were decided under former attorneys general, rolling back protections for women. The Biden administration has one of the executive orders that issued in February is requiring the promulgation of new regulations by October that would address the ground of asylum that women usually bring their claims under, the particular social group ground. And so we're working closely with the administration to provide them with our recommendations on what to include there to better protect women. We also have some proposals for the Refugee Protection Act. This is now on the legislative front. And we're hoping that some of those changes will better protect women. And finally, we are pushing very strongly for legislation that would add a sixth ground to the asylum refugee definition in our asylum statute. So as you mentioned earlier, the Refugee Convention in 1950s gender-based claims were not even recognized. And so in many ways in the last 4 years, the landscape has changed even and made it even worse for women, because it's not that they haven't been recognized, it's that they've been proactively attacked. So what we're trying to do is make sure that going forward, women don't have to rely on the particular social group ground for the majority of their cases, that they could actually bring them under a sixth ground for gender. And this is our top priority right now on the legislative front. And I can, if people have questions about that, obviously, I can answer those later. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. We are a little over time in terms of ending the Q&A, but I do want to hear from Mr. Hydari in terms of, you talked about two cases, Turkey and Bangladesh, in terms of Refugee Solidarity Network's work in trying to create the legislative framework through which refugees can seek asylum status. What are the very specific sort of opportunities you have seen and also obstacles you've seen in trying to work with two very different kinds of governments in trying to sort of get recognition for the fact that these individuals are requiring legal protection from persecution and should not obviously be deported?
Yeah, I mean, I would focus, since we're, we have a US audience that we're speaking to, I would say that, what's important is to continue to uphold a positive standard in the US around issues related to asylum and refugee claims, and set the standard by which we can promote other countries to ascribe to. What we've seen in the last many years, not just with this previous administration, but with others as well, is some backsliding with regards to international norms and international standards. So the work that all the panelists are doing, the important work that others are doing to improve standards of asylum in the US goes a long way in helping set the type of standard that we can help promote internationally. That's one thing. Another thing is that the US can extend support to these host countries overseas in a lot of different ways. And so while this important work is being done in the US to uphold asylum standards and conditions, we should also be supporting host nations abroad financially, but also through other gestures. We're obviously going to be building back the resettlement system under this new administration. Resettlement is a way to show support with other host countries abroad, but also through overseas humanitarian assistance and direct funding for projects on the ground that directly serve refugees and asylum seekers, and through advocacy and engagement with international partners at the government level. We've seen many positive signs coming out of the new administration, and we obviously hope that a lot of them develop. There's been executive orders issued that speak to developing regional cooperation frameworks, promoting and building up asylum systems in other countries as well, to help create more international cooperation, but in a positive way, where we're not just expecting other nations to shoulder the responsibility, but actually actively assisting them to build up their capacity and provide them with resources to do so.
Thank you. Before I turn to the Q&A, and it seems a number of Q&A have come with regard to people trying to understand what they should do perhaps in their own individual cases in terms of navigating the US system. But just, talking to young people, undergraduate and graduate students who might be interested in getting involved in the question of asylum, I want to open the floor and just ask, how can people be engaged with the conversation about asylum in the DMV area, in the US, more broadly speaking, and certainly in the international arena? If any of you have some suggestions for people to follow up on after this panel is over, if they have interest they wish to pursue, I'd really appreciate some of your thoughts. Mr. Lopez, you want to go ahead first?
Sure. I think in terms of locally getting involved, I think becoming familiarized with organizations that provide services to asylees, asylum seekers, refugees. The need is great, right? And it's not just the legal, because these asylum seekers are just a part of our communities as well. They're facing the same kind of financial constraints and crises that was born through this pandemic and all other and everything else, that is implicated when we're, confronting systemic discrimination and systemic injustices in terms of policing and over-policing in communities of color. I think some really concrete things are, there are, for example, at the local government level, at the state level, here in Maryland, there are a lot of legislative efforts underway by grassroots organizations and legal service providers to change policies that are going to directly impact asylees and asylum seekers who have been members of our communities for years in our experience. So some concrete things. There's a bill right now at the Maryland state in Annapolis to provide a right to counsel in immigration proceedings. The impact of legal representation is immense. I would say getting involved in a campaign like that. There's another bill called the Trust Act in Maryland that is also pending in this legislative session. Becoming involved in those kind of campaigns will create better local outcomes here. And from my vantage point, that's kind of the vehicle for change that I see here locally. But with that, I'll step back.
Thank you. Mr. Djibril, is there anything specific you want to add to what Mr. Lopez said in terms of involvement?
I mean, not necessarily, but I would just like to say people are more likely get involved on what they feel like it is important. So, for example, if there is some LGBTQ or gender student who are concerned about their own issue, I would like just to say that just know that there is immigrants who are facing the same issue that you are facing right now. So just get involved, just get informed, and just get advocate for those kind of topics.
Thank you, Mr. Djibril. Ms. Sullivan?
Yeah, I echo my fellow panelists and all those ideas. I think there are so many opportunities for volunteering or just learning more about these topics. And so I would just encourage you to get in touch with me. I don't know if you're sharing our contact info, but I'm happy to share mine. And there's translator opportunities, pro bono help, etc. And so feel free to get in touch and I can connect you with service providers in your area.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Mr. Hydari, it's a little more complicated, but we probably have international students as well as students who are interested in asylum more globally. What kind of recommendations would you make for them to understand and engage with this issue more broadly outside of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, for those who have connections to, who are coming from internationally, who have connections or can recognize other strengths that they can bring in terms of language skills. Diaspora communities can often play a role in interfacing and trying to extend support from the U.S. to other places in the world. And for those who are interested in a more sort of international humanitarian assistance work and international relations, there are definitely organizations that are working on those levels if you don't want to be directly engaged with the communities in the U.S. So I think there. Do some research into the organizations that are working in that respect. Similar to the previous panelist, I'm happy to be a resource if people want to reach out and look into opportunities like that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities overseas, even though that can feel far away, particularly now with the pandemic. But as there are opportunities out there that I think people can tap into.
All right, thank you so much. Turning to the Q&A session, there are quite a number of comments with regard to, people have specific questions about their own cases perhaps, or reflecting on specific ways in which asylum could be made smoother. There is a question about the USCIS. In your assessment, for any of you who are entangling with USCIS, is there a sense that it is working a little faster when it comes to questions of asylum, as opposed to perhaps in the past administration? Does anyone want to answer that? Ms. Sullivan?
I'll take it. I mean, I'm not sure that we're in a position to be able to tell if things are moving faster yet. It's very early, and given what they inherited, I'm not sure that is so realistic at this time. But what we are seeing is almost immediately is much more stakeholder engagement. So we're much, if something is taking too long, I'm much more confident that we're able to communicate with this administration about why that might be and try to get it expedited if it's appropriate in that case. So I'll just say that, and others can jump in.
A second question is, outside of obviously Central American asylum seekers, there is also obviously African and Middle Eastern irregular migrants who are at the U.S. border. And based on your experiences, what are the kinds of observations you've made about, the demographics of asylum seekers at the U.S. border currently? No. I think one of the things we need to sort of think about is the fact that, particularly because the European routes are more or less closed in many ways, that a lot of people are being rerouted to seek asylum at the U.S. border. It's not one of those things that we reflect on, and the complexity involved with transit routes, and obviously the role of human smugglers in that regard, is something that we need to sort of reflect on, because we do have a much more diverse range in terms of asylum seekers from certain African countries, Middle Eastern countries, certainly obviously from Latin America, that we may not have thought of, because in the framing of asylum seekers, particularly in the media, we do focus a lot on Central American asylum seekers and not really pay attention to the fact that there are asylum seekers from India, from the Congo, Afghanistan, so on and so forth, that we need to also think about. One question that there has come up is with regard to climate refugees, and I know that this is a much broader conversation. The 1951 Refugee Act does not obviously recognize climate-based displacement as a particular area of protection. Do any of our speakers want to take that question in terms of trying to address questions of protection for those who have been displaced? Although, of course, climate not being the only driver of forcible displacement, it works in conjunction with other political factors. Anyone who wants to answer that question? Mr. Hydari?
I mean, I would just say shortly that I think there are very interesting things happening in this realm, and I think that, like you pointed out, a lot of the cases are actually rooted in some other element that can usually be captured in the 5 grounds. We see a lot of times the communities that are most adversely affected by some of the climate issues are, for example, indigenous communities, which can then highlight other aspects of their identity and can be relied upon to be included in the current 5 convention grounds. But we also see other interesting movement within the international community pushing for greater recognition. But I think it's about being creative with advocacy and direct assistance in such cases, to try to identify something else, like you said, that's associated with the claim that can be relied upon, because I think it's going to be very difficult to see that the expansion of the definition to include climate-related displacement anytime soon, but there is a lot of good energy in that regard.
Thank you. There is a question about subjectivity related to the determination of asylum, particularly when it comes to asylum officers. Is there a way of sort of working through that so that that is not a most influential factor in terms of determining who gets asylum and who doesn't, and in line of what you are working on, in line with what you're working on? Ms. Sullivan?
I can address that. I think, again, what we're going to be seeing more and more with this current administration is much more transparency and accountability in that regard, I'm hoping. Yeah, I think with restoration of in-depth training, ongoing repeated training, particularly when there's a lot of attrition among asylum officers who might be experiencing secondary trauma by working in the field and doing interviews over and over. It's a real challenge because you're having to train new people over and over. But I think I'm hopeful that advocates are working with USCIS on this very issue to try and push for more training and accountability. And I think those two pieces are going to be critical for trying to restore some measure of a more objective approach. As I mentioned earlier, there are decision makers who simply ignore the law when they disagree with it. It's a huge problem. And so I'm hoping for a new approach slowly but surely. So hopefully we'll see that.
Thank you. The last question is about the time that it takes to seek asylum, that it is long, it is arduous, it's extremely exhausting. Are there ways in which that time frame could be shortened? Because, that is one of the challenges as asylum seekers constantly face, either in the United States or elsewhere. So any of your thoughts in terms of making the asylum process more effective? Mr. Lopez, did you want to say something to that?
I think my perspective might, in terms of the detained adult representation, is slightly different in that claims are too rushed. Claims are just plowed through the detention immigration process and system in that the timeline for detained cases is just a rapid timeline. It's incredibly fast. So I don't think I'm necessarily the best to speak about this, but there is an issue with definitely the timely adjudication of these claims. I think, I don't know, for me, it seems more, from my perspective in terms of representing detained adults, it's less about the timeliness of processing the claim, but more about the legal viability of sustaining an asylum claim, despite the person having been present in the US for years, right? Despite not having applied within the first year. And so one particular area is kind of dependent on the different cases, the different federal circuit court of appeals across the country and different immigration courts. What venue your case takes place in greatly determines an outcome in any particular asylum case, unfortunately. I think just continuing to challenge the wrongful application of the legal standard across different venues across the United States, I think is going to continue to be important. But that's kind of a larger systemic view of that. But again, my focus is on the detained adult population. So maybe I'll step back and see if others have thoughts on the non-detained context.
Ms. Sullivan, I think you have been waiting to say something on this.
I'll just say, I wanted to just add that when the backlogs are so long, survivors of gender-based violence are very vulnerable to re-victimization. And so while they're waiting for protection, hopefully in the meantime, they're much at the mercy of human traffickers and abusers. And it's a huge problem. And I think there are a lot of inefficiencies in our system. And for example, the expedited removal credible fear screening process, every asylum case is touched many times by different adjudicators because of this sort of two-step process. And I think there's a lot of merit to the idea of eliminating that process entirely for asylum seekers so that they're just applying once instead of going through this mini interview during the credible fear screening process. And so that's one major example where I think inefficiencies can really be scaled back. And the original impetus for the program was at the time to combat fraud in the asylum process, but we have a lot of measures in place anyway to address those issues. So to my mind, it's an unnecessarily burdensome two-step process that could go a long way toward eliminating helping to eliminate backlogs.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time now to answer the questions. I think we are 5 minutes over time, but this has been such an exceptional opportunity to engage with people in the front lines in the United States and also elsewhere in trying to deal with this complex question of asylum, which, as I mentioned earlier, has become so politicized and so political. I want to thank all the panelists for the energy, enthusiasm, and insight you've brought to this discussion and helping to educate all the attendees today. Thank you for the attendees for your questions and for taking the time out of your busy day to have this conversation with us. We hope you can join us for the next SIS event, which will be the last part of our Global IR Dialogue series on March 24th. So thank you and have a good evening. And again, thank you to the panelists and the attendees for making this such a successful one.